So we're looking first of all at Dickinson's poem "There's a Certain Slant of Light," which is in many ways a really sort of characteristic poem that will function as a really effective introduction to Dickinson's concerns and her poetic style. Now, two contextual factors that are important to bear in mind before we approach Dickinson as a writer is to bear in mind that she grew up in Massachusetts, famed for its legacy of kind of puritanical Christianity, coming from the early days of the first settlers in America, and particularly engaging with a religious context of Calvinism, a kind of a puritanical brand of Christianity that had a couple of essential principles that this poem in particular contends with and resists. Now, this is a poem that engages with the natural world and takes as its sort of focal point a representation of nature. But what it also does is engages with the tradition of seeing the natural world as a source of inspiration, which is a legacy of Romanticism, and actually identifies within the natural world not inspiration, but the impetus for spiritual despair. Now, what's important to bear in mind here is that spiritual despair, which is one of the central themes of the poem, is a central sin that prevents redemption in Calvinistic theology. The other one is presumption, the belief that to be saved you don't need to practice virtue. And so Dickinson's central formulation in terms of her argument in this poem is one that is a fundamental sort of pivotal sin in Calvinist theology. One of the central principles of Calvinism is what's called unconditional election, which asserts that God has chosen those whom he will bring to himself, not based on virtue, merit, or faith in those people. So people are predestined, it's a theology of predestination, to be one of the elect who is saved. And those chosen receive salvation through Christ alone and are known as the elect. And those not chosen receive the just wrath that is warranted for their sins against God. There's this very kind of, it's a fundamentalist more form of Christianity, this very categorical black and white description and distinction of the saved and the unsaved, the elect and those damned to eternity in the fires of hell. And all men are absolutely sinful according to Calvinist doctrine. So we've got this absolute sin that's at the centre of the Calvinist understanding of the nature of being and the nature of spiritual existence. What Dickinson concerns herself with in this poem is a scene much like this one. This is the best sort of physical equivalent that I could find for the landscape that I think is the source of the description in this particular poem, a certain slant of light on winter afternoons. What she's trying to characterize here is this particular quality of light during a winter scene that betokens a sense of mortality and the extinguishing of life, and then the spiritual insight that comes along with that awareness of the transience of existence and of the dilemma that brings with it in a philosophical sense of not knowing necessarily what the destiny of the soul is, or if there even is one. So this is not locating in the Romantic tradition nature as a source of sort of ecstatic or transcendental inspiration, but rather the opposite, locating in nature actually the logical basis for a sense of spiritual dejection, which is very consciously being sort of posited as the central argument of the poem. And Dickinson is very conscious of the fact that that's one of the central sins in the religious upbringing which she's surrounded by. Now, the first lines: there's a certain slant of light on winter afternoons. Now, the first line obviously is trying to define a certain quality of the light, a certain feature of the light, its sort of distinctive nature and quality. One of the first instances of this technical feature that Dickinson uses, which informally is known as a conversion, but it's actually in traditional rhetorical terms called anthemeria, which is using a word within a part of speech that it familiarly wouldn't be. So slant in this case is usually a verb or an adjective. You move in a slant-wise fashion, perhaps be an adverbial, or the appearance of that wall is slant or slanted. Here, it's being used as a noun, and I think we've got within that. If you take a type of word that's usually used to suggest movement or action or the distinctive feature of something, and taking it then and shifting it to be a thing itself, it suggests the nature of the entire poem, the effort to define something emotional, spiritual, or subjective in concrete or rational terms. She's trying to take the nature of spiritual dejection and find physical equivalents for it in the environment, and that mirrors the movement of something like a verb or an adjective into the status of a noun. So that anthemeria there captures that movement of something enigmatic and fluid and attempting to give it the status of a thing, which is something that is absolutely central to her poetic style. They're often called poems of definition, where she seeks to define abstract experiences and intangible and enigmatic experiences in concrete terms or in rational intellectual terms. It's important that it's on a winter afternoon, because the poem is set in terms of time just before the light expires, and that the light is equated with spiritual hope, and its loss is equated with despair. So we're at the moment where the light is about to disappear, that certain slant of light that is just about to extinguish itself. And it's important in terms of the poem's overall thematic concerns that that's the moment in which it is set. Worth stressing is the word certain. There's a certain slant of light, which is, I think in this case, a pun. It means obviously a particular slant of light. Or, ironically, it could be being used as a sort of ironic reference of the uncertain nature of the experience itself. There's a particular quality of light, or there's a certain quality of light. This quality of light that Dickinson tries to define as anything but certain. It's extremely enigmatic and intangible. And so I think there's a kind of play on words here, because, if the physical qualities of this slant of light were certain, there would be no basis for her poetic inspiration in trying to define the features of this sensory experience. A certain slant of light oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. So it's, in one sense, oppressive. It's kind of powerful and burdens the observer with kind of spiritual angst. That verb there gives us that sense of its power, and the effect in subjective terms that this quality of the winter light can have on the internal life of the observer. And it's like the heft of cathedral tunes. What she means here is the weight of severe music. And I think of a spiritual weight that comes from a loss of hope that you experience looking at a scene of this nature. When we think of oppressive light, though, there's something contradictory about this in conventional religious symbolism, that we see light as a source of redemption, as a source of optimism. But this quality of the winter light is oppressive, and that is contradictory in the traditional sense of religious, the religious vision of the symbolism of light. What we have here as well is the sense that the landscape is being compared, obviously, in the simile here, like the heft of cathedral tunes, to artistic experience and spiritual experience. It's oppressive to the spirit, but it also has the aesthetic power of cathedral music. And so we've got then a dialogue between the internal state of the observer and the aesthetic nature of the scene, which I think almost invokes the romantic tradition of seeing nature almost as a sort of work of art that is capable of creating a sense of uplifting, rejuvenating spiritual experience inside the observer and the poet. But here, that internal-external dialogue between observer and scene is aesthetic in nature. It oppresses like the power, the heft of cathedral music, but produces the reverse in terms of its outcome. It produces the spiritual dejection instead of a sort of ecstatic optimism. Importantly, in this opening stanza, the boundary between the internal life of the observer and the external life of the landscape is completely open or non-existent. The observing self is in almost kind of complete dialogue with the scene, the external world that this sort of observing poetic speaker is engaged with. So there is a great openness between observer and external environment. It's just simply that openness produces a sort of negative spiritual outcome, where in the romantic tradition or the transcendentalist tradition, it might be the opposite. It might produce a sort of ecstatic or optimistic spiritual outcome. Importantly, it's worth noting that the variation in sensory language that Dickinson uses in this opening stanza. She attempts to define the nature of the sensory experience that leads to the spiritual experience of despair, but in doing so, invokes light and sound, weight and touch, music and sound, and time in all of these various registers of sensory awareness. So what we'd call the phenomenology of this experience, the features that are involved in the perception of this experience are varied and kind of pull against each other. This is a poetic device that's often called synesthesia, where you have a mixture or blurring of the senses. It suggests firstly that the origin of the experience is sensory or external, but because of its sensory variety and its uncertain quality, suggests also its enigmatic nature, its difficulty, its the way in which the experience actually eludes language, and the way that it almost pulls language apart in terms of the way in which language makes sense of experience. It sort of pulls at those abilities of language to make sense of experience through this sensory mixture. So what we get then is obviously an insight into the nature of trying to pin down an enigmatic spiritual experience that is very difficult to pin down and define with language. And that's precisely her style. She moves into a suggestion of the impact of this particular scene. Heavenly hurt is the way that she describes it, first of all. It gives us, and we can find no scar. So we have this kind of oxymoronic construction here, heavenly hurt, which is obviously emphasized even further by the aspirant alliteration, the breathy H sound, the heavenly hurt. But in this text, it's logical for suggesting a sense of spiritual despair that is heavenly derived and part of God's plan. The winter scene gives us a sense of spiritual angst that is heavenly in its origins. It's spiritual in its nature. So this oxymoron, whilst in theological terms seems oxymoronic, in terms of the logic of Dickinson's argument here, that the spiritual world, the external world, of the physical landscape, can in some ways produce a negative, dejecting spiritual outcome. This construction makes perfect sense. Importantly, there's no scar. We can find no scar, and this description here suggests to us that there's no tangible physical evidence of this sort of spiritual wounding that the landscape creates upon us. There's no tangible proof that this has occurred, in spite of the fact that it's still certainly experienced and deeply felt. We've got this sense of the dialogue between heaven and the spirit, between landscape and the senses, and between the external and internal worlds, that's going on in this fluid fashion and in this intense fashion, but which there's very little sensory objective evidence for this dialogue. It's going on, its workings are extremely mysterious and fluid. And here's the only outcome: internal difference where the meanings are. Now, this is deliberately vague. This is a deliberately vague description by Dickinson. It's worth focusing just on the concept, the noun phrase that she uses here: internal difference. This is a noun phrase with difference being the noun, and evokes again by saying what it isn't. If the thing itself is difference, we never really get a clear picture of what that thing is. If the thing itself is absence, then we again don't know what the thing is. It evokes its quality, a sense of subjective and internal disturbance, a sense of subjective change by evoking what it isn't. It's not the state that you were in before you saw this winter scene. And that's the consequence of looking at it, is that there's an internal difference. But we still, again, don't exactly know what that is. We haven't been told what that internal difference is in ontological terms, the nature of the being that you become after this difference has been created. So this intentionally vague phrase gives us a sense of the subjective inner world as the locus of spiritual meaning, where the meanings are. We've got this sense that emphatically spiritual meaning is resident within the self, within the individual. And that's, I think, where Dickinson borrows from that Emersonian transcendentalist tradition and resists Calvinist theology in locating any soul that does exist. And she's very cagey about defining one. But what she's certain of is that it's resident within the individual and it isn't located in this sort of abstract sense outside of the individual. What we're given is just simply the sense that something has changed, but that single word subordinate clause, where the meanings are, that's completely unusual here. This relative or subordinate clause shifts the meaning from affirming where the meanings are resident. This comma changes it entirely. Where the meanings are, the emphasis is on the where. But here, where the meanings are, the emphasis there is on an affirmation of their reality, that they are, in fact, extant. They exist in some way. And so that emphasis is in some way affirming an individual or subjective reality, and that the place itself is not really important. So what we've then got then is a sense of some kind of spiritual life contained within the individual and affected by the phenomenology of perceiving the scene. But again, if we're talking about the impact of the spiritual experience, okay, Emily, what's the traceable impact of looking at this winter scene in spiritual terms? Well, I'll have you. What it creates is internal difference where the meanings are. You leave thinking, well, what on earth is that? Simply that a subjective change takes place, and that there is an emphasis on some form of vital spiritual internal experience, a real internal self that is potentially spiritual in its dimension. So all we've got out of this is that seeing the scene affects the individual and transforms their spiritual nature in some way. But in what fashion, we're not exactly sure at this point. What we know is, again, we flesh out this experience by dealing with its sort of proxies and its contingencies, the things that are attached in some way to the experience. None may teach it any, 'tis the sealed despair. So what we could be focusing on here is the concept of despair itself being final or irrevocable. It cannot be learned by anyone. None may teach it any, the sealed despair. The sealed despair is the thing that none may teach. Or, and this kind of pivots around this word any, and which part of the sentence you see it relating to, and it's deliberately ambiguous. That no human can recreate this experience for someone else. None may teach it anyone. 'Tis the sealed despair. So we've got these two meanings here, these unstable interpretations, hinging on the word any. Firstly, that despair itself is irrevocable, and that it can't be taught anything. You can't teach the seal despair anything. It is a final, irrevocable experience, and that's what she's trying to describe, this state of despair. Or the fact that the experience of despair itself is something that can't be taught for someone else. So we've got this ambiguity about the power of despair and the limited capacity for communicating the nature of this experience to anyone. So you get this enormous sense of someone being trapped in this sense of spiritual dejection and despair. It's both final and irrevocable and can't be changed. It can't be taught any. It can't be taught anything. but then it also can't be communicated to anyone else exactly. And that's what this poem struggles against. It's an effort to do it, but I think an implicit admission that it in some way fails. Now, in theological terms, this is a paradox, the seal despair. The seal in Calvinist theology is the binding covenant that guarantees the entry of the elect into heaven. So the seal is the sort of the emblem of that predestination and election. Now, despair obviously precludes the entry of a soul into heaven. It works in the opposite direction. It stops people from accessing heaven and being divine in some way. So here, obviously, there's a theological paradox at work here. You can't seal despair because a seal means going to heaven, and a despair precludes that possibility. Now, I think here Dickinson's rebelliously giving the sin the status of the divine, the sin of despair, elevating the intensity of the experience to the sort of experience that would guarantee your election into heaven. It's saying this experience of spiritual dejection is as important as the positive experiences that are supposedly there for the elect that guarantee and testify to their heavenly status. It's an imperial affliction sent as of the air. Again, the phrase is paradoxical in some respects, an imperial affliction. The experience of despair is imperial in order of its magnitude. It's powerful and godly and almost like an emperor. But it's an affliction of the spirit. So it's sublime in terms of its power. It's extremely epic almost in terms of its scale and scope, this despair. But it's oppressive in terms of its effect. So we've got that kind of almost paradoxical sense there of the power of something of this nature to create something negative, which is working in the opposite direction to the traditions of Calvinist theology, powerful spiritual experiences that give you a deep sense of conviction in your spiritual redemption, but also the romantic tradition of locating that ecstatic spiritual experience in the landscape and in the natural world. And it's sent as of the air. So there's something antithetical, I think, about the nature of the experience itself, that it's imperial in its power and is sent enigmatically through the air. So the power of the experience and the gentleness of its source or its method of communication is antithetical. And so again, we've got that sense of fragility, I think, of the individual self, open to such profound spiritual dejection through such subtle and delicate means of communication. It's gentle in the way that it achieves its effect, but sort of enormous in its consequences. This concluding part of the poem is utterly brilliant, I think, in my opinion. When it comes, this slant of light, the landscape listens and shadows hold their breath. So we've got this absolutely brilliant vision, I think, here of the landscape and the natural world being brought to life by their sense of foreboding, that they are about to be extinguished by the movement of light away into darkness. And the personification here of the landscape listening, which again is suggested through that alliteration, shows us almost as if the trees and the bushes are awaiting their own death as the light is about to die. The landscape is listening carefully for any suggestion about what's about to occur. It's almost poised on its toes, waiting for valuable information that's going to extinguish its existence. And shadows hold their breath, and there's something extraordinarily clever about this. That shadows themselves, in this personified state of holding their breath, eagerly anticipating their own mortality. Of course, because they rely on light for their existence. Without light, you don't have shadow, even though everything then becomes shadow. So we have again this sense of the light just about to extinguish this sense of vitality from things themselves that are shadowy and negative. So it has this enormous power here to take out light, and for light to take out spiritual optimism. And that's what Dickinson is locating in the scene, is the extinguishing of the light being in some way the physical sensory equivalent for the disappearance, the irrevocable nature of spiritual despair. And that irrevocable nature of spiritual despair is suggested in this final couplet. When it goes, it is like the distance on the look of death. So when once despair has been experienced, these lines seem to be saying, it's irrecoverable. We can't switch it around and unexperience despair. We can't undo that insight and that profound emotional transformation that takes place and spiritual transformation that takes place that she describes simply through the internal difference. When it happens, it's like the distance on the look of death, that in some way, this sense of despair with distance and death being repeated through that dental alliteration, that powerful D sound, gives us this sort of powerful punch towards the end of both of these lines, but it's not the final syllable in either of them. And so there's this whispering, distance, death, afterwards, as the sound of that powerful D alliteration fades into what are called feminine endings here. And the sound itself is of gradual extinction of things gradually dying out. Listens, distance, death. There's that shift from very heavily punctuated alliterative sounds, listens, distance, death, to these whispered, almost sibilant endings. And there's something ironic here, that this despair is irrecoverable, because it's akin to the absolute end of mortality. Because the great irony is that this belief would create the despair described, that mortality is the absolute end. And so what we've got then is this sort of rationalist vision of mortality, that, you know, the distance on the look of death is that final moment of irrecoverable mortality, and that itself is the reason for this sense of spiritual dejection. In the landscape, in the light of this winter scene, and the sudden extinguishing of that light, I see a sort of physical correlative for the ultimate finality of life, its transience, and the absence of some sort of spiritual redemption in an afterlife. So this extraordinarily well-crafted conclusion that creates that sense of despairing transformation into a kind of void, instead of that optimistic sort of heavenly vision of the afterlife.